Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into a really common pattern, and how we all tend to interact when conflict sparks up. It's called the drama triangle. It's a concept first identified way back in 1968 by psychiatrist Stephen Karpman.
Right.
You know how sometimes disagreements just seem to spiral, and everyone ends up feeling, well, worse. Okay, let's unpack this because the drama triangle really shines a light on why that happens. It outlines these specific roles we can unconsciously slip into.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is that these roles, the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor, they aren't really about who someone actually is in a situation. It's
Right.
more about the particular stance they take,
Yeah.
how they engage with others. Karpman noticed these recurring patterns, these almost predictable ways people act out conflict.
Exactly. So let's start with the first role,
Yeah.
the victim. Now, when we say victim, it's not necessarily about someone who has genuinely been harmed, although, that can certainly be part of a situation. Instead, it describes someone who feels or acts like a victim. Think of that inner monologue, like, poor me, nothing ever goes my way. You might recognize this feeling, maybe in yourself or others. The sources we looked at really highlight that someone in this role often believes they are helpless, that nothing they do will make a difference, and that trying to change things is just a waste of time, even if they've made some attempts.
Yeah, they can feel really persecuted, oppressed, hopeless, powerless, maybe even a deep sense of shame.
Right. And you might notice they struggle to make decisions or solve problems or even experience much joy sometimes.
And, it's important to understand this victim stance often serves a purpose, even if it's not conscious.
Okay.
Think about times you felt overwhelmed. Was there a part of you that even subtly kind of signaled to others that you needed saving?
Yeah, I can see that.
As our sources point out, by feeling like a victim, a person might unconsciously avoid taking responsibility for their part in the situation, or maybe avoid facing some uncomfortable truths. And they might also be seeking someone to come to their rescue, which, naturally leads us to the next role in this dynamic.
Right, that brings us to the rescuer. This is the person who jumps in with that "let me help you"
Yeah.
attitude. Have you ever felt like compelled to fix someone else's problems?
Yes.
Sometimes even before they've fully said what's wrong.
Oh, yeah. Rescuers often feel almost guilty if they don't try to help, To alleviate the victim's distress, they often go above and beyond, sometimes even at their own expense.
But here's where it gets really interesting. While the rescuer thinks they're being helpful, the sources highlight that their actions can actually keep the victim dependent
Exactly.
and prevent them from learning from their own experiences or facing the natural consequences of their choices.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the rescuer might be driven by a few different underlying needs, right?
Like what?
Well, they might be unconsciously trying to avoid facing their own problems by focusing all their energy on someone else. Or they might get a sense of self-worth from feeling indispensable, needed.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the irony is, when their rescuing efforts don't lead to lasting change, and they often don't because they're not really empowering the victim, the rescuer can feel unappreciated, frustrated, and sometimes even slip into the third role, the persecutor.
Ah, the persecutor. Okay, this is the person who criticizes, controls, maybe lays the blame squarely on others. Sound familiar in any interactions? Think of the classic, "this is all your fault." They can be really unpleasant to be around, often denying their own weaknesses and instead focusing intensely on the perceived flaws of others.
Yeah, the sources describe their communication style as often involving lecturing, preaching, maybe using offensive, demeaning, or even sarcastic remarks. Just constant criticism, maybe even contempt.
And like you just said, if the persecutor then gets blamed themselves, watch out, they might just switch into playing the victim.
Right. This fluidity of roles is a really crucial aspect of the drama triangle. It's not like people get permanently stuck in one position. Instead, they tend to cycle through them, sometimes really quickly, and it's this very switching that keeps the whole unhealthy dynamic going.
So instead of actually addressing the underlying issues and finding real solutions.
Exactly. Everyone involved just remains trapped in this uncomfortable loop of blame, guilt, and emotional pain. Have you ever felt like you're just going in circles in an argument? This might be why.
Definitely. And it's not just in romantic relationships, is it?
Not at all.
The sources we looked at make it really clear that these patterns can pop up pretty much anywhere, in friendships, within families, at work, even in broader social groups. It's a surprisingly pervasive way conflict can play out.
Which raises a really important question, I think. What is it that actually fuels this whole drama? Several sources point to shame as a really key underlying emotion.
Shame.
Yeah, shame is that incredibly painful feeling, that deep-seated belief that something is wrong with me at a fundamental level. Have you ever experienced that feeling like you're inherently flawed?
Oof, yeah. That makes so much sense when you think about it. So how does this feeling of shame connect to these different roles then?
Well, according to the material, individuals playing the victim role might avoid taking responsibility because they're terrified of failing, right? And having that core feeling of shame confirmed,
Right.
rescuers might desperately need to feel needed by others to counteract their own underlying feelings of unworthiness,
Right, to feel valuable.
And persecutors, they might lash out and criticize others as a way to project their own insecurities and avoid having to confront that feeling of shame within themselves.
Wow. And the really unfortunate part is that these roles, while being adopted as a way to maybe cope with shame.
They actually end up reinforcing and increasing those very feelings and leading to more disconnection from others. It becomes a real vicious cycle.
Absolutely. So what are the actual effects of getting caught in this drama triangle? It sounds pretty negative across the board.
It really is. One of the most significant effects is that it keeps conflicts going indefinitely without ever really resolving them.
Right, because no one's dealing with a real issue.
Exactly. Because everyone is so focused on playing out their specific role in the drama, the deeper underlying issues simply aren't being addressed. It also fosters emotional manipulation.
How so?
Well, people might be using guilt or blame or even sort of faking helplessness to try and get their needs met in unhealthy and indirect ways. Have you ever felt like you were being manipulated in a conflict? This could be part of it.
Yeah. And it really stops people from taking genuine responsibility, doesn't it?
Totally.
The victim blames external factors or other people. The rescuer takes on way too much responsibility for others' problems. And the persecutor blames everyone else. It seems like no one is really looking inward at their own stuff.
Precisely. And the sources also highlight some very specific negative outcomes for each role. Rescuers can end up feeling completely drained, unappreciated, maybe even resentful because their efforts don't lead to any lasting positive change.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
Individuals in the victim role can end up feeling constantly blamed and criticized, especially if the persecutor in the dynamic is particularly dominant. And just being around someone who consistently plays the persecutor role, that can create a really toxic environment for everyone involved, filled with anxiety, fear, resentment. Have you ever experienced that kind of dynamic?
Unfortunately, yes. It's interesting how this plays out in different areas of life too, isn't it?
Definitely.
The material mentioned that in unhealthy romantic relationships, these roles can become very deeply ingrained, just reinforcing those negative behaviors, making it seem almost impossible to find any real resolution.
Yeah, it's like Groundhog Day.
And in the workplace,
Yeah.
a persecutor mentality in leadership can really breed a culture of fear, right? And stifle innovation.
Absolutely. And inversely, managers who are constantly rescuing their teams might actually be hindering their growth and problem-solving abilities. They're not letting them learn.
That's a good point. And what about someone with a victim mindset at work?
Well, it can negatively affect their productivity, their overall career progression. If someone consistently feels helpless and unable to influence things, they're far less likely to take initiative or seek out solutions or effectively overcome challenges.
Yeah, you hold yourself back.
And of course, the persecutor's behavior in any setting can severely damage relationships by just eroding trust and creating that climate of anxiety and fear we mentioned.
Okay. Now, one of the sources specifically brought up the connection between codependency and the drama triangle. Can you explain how those two ideas relate?
Yeah, this is a really insightful connection. Codependency at its core often involves an unhealthy reliance on another person for your emotional well-being, right? And a tendency to consistently prioritize their needs above your own. The rescuer-victim dynamic within the drama triangle is a really classic example of how codependency can manifest. The rescuer feels this almost uncontrollable urge to take care of the perceived victim, which in turn keeps the victim dependent. And the victim's reliance then reinforces the rescuer's need to be needed. It's a mutually reinforcing, although deeply unhealthy, pattern.
So in that situation, the codependent person would typically be the one playing the rescuer constantly trying to fix the victim.
Usually, yes, but it's actually even more complex than that.
Oh.
The sources point out that individuals with codependent tendencies might actually cycle through all three roles: rescuing, persecuting, and even playing the victim as a way to try and exert control in their relationships.
Control. Okay.
Yeah, and this need for control is often driven by those underlying feelings of anger and shame we talked about earlier. The anger can often be a secondary emotion, sort of a protective layer, masking the deeper, more vulnerable feelings of shame and unworthiness.
That's a really important point about control. The material even mentioned that individuals who consistently play the persecutor role in codependent relationships can sometimes be mistaken for people with narcissistic traits.
Yes, exactly. The outward behaviors, the blaming, the controlling can appear quite similar on the surface.
Right.
And it's also really crucial to understand that in a codependent dynamic, the person being labeled as the victim might only be perceived that way in the codependent person's mind.
Ah, as a justification.
Yeah, maybe as a way to justify their own rescuing or even persecuting actions. It's often a very subjective and sometimes quite distorted perception of reality.
Wow. This all paints a pretty clear picture of just how damaging getting caught in the drama triangle can be in all sorts of relationships. So the big question is, how do we actually break free from this? What are some concrete ways to step off this destructive cycle?
Well, the good news is that it absolutely is possible to break free. The very first step, which almost all the sources emphasize, is developing awareness.
Okay.
You have to become able to recognize when you yourself are slipping into one of these roles, whether it's as the victim, the rescuer, or the persecutor.
So like pausing and noticing?
Exactly. Reflecting honestly on your feelings, do you often find yourself feeling helpless? Or maybe overburdened by the needs of others? Or perhaps consistently critical and judgmental? This kind of self-reflection is a really crucial starting point.
Okay, so awareness of your own patterns is key.
Yeah.
What comes next? What actions can we take?
Setting clear and healthy boundaries is absolutely essential.
Boundaries, right?
For those who tend to fall into the rescuer role, this means learning to say no sometimes. Saying no to requests that are beyond your capacity or that just enable others' dependence.
That can be hard.
It can be very hard. It also involves really understanding your own limits and making your own self-care a priority.
Yeah.
For everyone, though, setting boundaries means learning to express your own needs and preferences honestly, and knowing when it's necessary to step back or just disengage from unhealthy dynamics.
Boundaries make a lot of sense. It's about protecting your own well-being while also sort of allowing others to take responsibility for themselves. What other strategies can help?
Several sources highlight the importance of challenging those negative thinking patterns. This is where therapeutic approaches like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT can be really effective.
Okay, CBT.
Yeah, CBT focuses on helping individuals identify and then change the negative thought patterns that often fuel these roles. So it can help you challenge those helpless thoughts if you tend towards the victim role,
Right.
or the guilt-driven thoughts if you're a rescuer, or that critical inner voice that drives persecuting behavior. CBT also helps build assertiveness skills, which are crucial for expressing your needs and setting those boundaries we just talked about.
And the material also mentioned a couple other types of therapy that might be helpful.
Yes, schema therapy can be particularly helpful for addressing those deeper, more long-standing emotional patterns that often underlie these struggles. Things like deeply ingrained feelings of abandonment or feeling fundamentally defective.
Okay, going deeper.
Right. And psychodynamic therapy can also provide valuable insight by uncovering the often unconscious roots of these patterns, helping you understand on a deeper level why you might be drawn to playing these particular roles.
So it's about understanding the why behind the behavior, as well as actively working to change the behavior itself. Now, beyond seeking professional therapy, are there more immediate shifts we can try to make in our day-to-day interactions?
Absolutely. The overarching goal is to consciously shift away from those reactive drama triangle roles and move towards healthier, more empowered ways of relating.
Okay, so shifting to what?
Well, instead of automatically feeling and acting like a victim, you can actively strive to become an empowered problem solver, taking responsibility for identifying and working towards solutions in your own life.
Right. Less poor me, more what can I do?
Exactly. And instead of jumping into rescue, you can aim to become a supportive ally, offering help when it's genuinely asked for, but always encouraging the other person's independence and self-reliance.
Okay, supporting, not taking over.
Mm-hmm. And instead of resorting to persecuting behaviors, you can focus on developing your skills as an assertive communicator, expressing your own needs and expectations clearly and respectfully.
That sounds like a much more constructive and ultimately more fulfilling way to engage. One of the sources mentioned the idea of becoming a challenger instead of a persecutor. What does that look like?
Yeah, a challenger in this context is someone who has clear expectations and can effectively set goals, but they do so without resorting to criticism, blame, or contempt.
So still holding people accountable, but differently.
Exactly. It's about holding others accountable for their actions in a respectful manner and offering constructive feedback aimed at growth, rather than simply tearing them down or making them feel inadequate. This also really ties back to the fundamental importance of establishing and maintaining healthy boundaries.
Okay, so the shift is away from blame and control towards clear expectations, mutual respect, and genuine support. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The material also touched on stopping the need for external validation. How does that play into breaking free?
That's a big one. When your own sense of worth and value becomes overly dependent on seeking approval from others or on playing a specific role within a dynamic, you become much more likely to stay stuck in those unhealthy patterns.
Right, because you need the role.
Precisely. Cultivating a strong sense of self-worth from within, rather than constantly seeking external validation, significantly reduces your need to play the victim to gain sympathy, the rescuer to feel needed, or the persecutor to feel powerful. It's all about building a solid foundation of internal self-acceptance and validation.
That sounds like a really important step towards fostering greater independence and healthier relationships. And the sources also strongly suggest seeking professional support when needed, right?
Yes, definitely. Therapy or coaching can provide invaluable guidance and support in the process of unlearning those deeply ingrained destructive habits and developing much healthier, more fulfilling relationship strategies. A trained professional can offer an objective perspective and help you navigate the challenges that inevitably arise when you start shifting these dynamics.
Now, one of our sources introduced David Emerald's empowerment triangle as a healthier alternative. Can you walk us through those roles and how they differ?
Certainly. Emerald's Empowerment Triangle offers a really positive and solution-focused framework. In this model, the victim transforms into a creator.
Creator, okay.
Instead of feeling helpless and asking, why me or poor me, the creator takes a proactive stance and asks, what can I do about this? They focus on taking responsibility for finding solutions, on actively engaging in personal growth, and on building their own resilience.
So a significant shift from feeling like things are happening to you to actively taking control and finding solutions. What about the persecutor role in this healthier model?
In the empowerment triangle, the persecutor shifts into a challenger.
Like we discussed before.
Exactly. But instead of criticizing and trying to control, the challenger focuses on encouraging growth through honesty and directness. They still hold others accountable, but they do so with respect and a focus on offering constructive feedback aimed at positive change, not just tearing them down. It's about pushing for improvement in a supportive, collaborative way.
And what becomes of the rescuer?
The rescuer evolves into a coach.
Coach? Interesting.
Yeah. Rather than jumping in to fix things and enable dependence, the coach provides support and guidance while actively encouraging the other person's independence and self-reliance. They ask empowering questions to help the individual find their own solutions. Rather than offering unsolicited advice or taking over the problem, the focus is on fostering the other person's capacity to help themselves.
So you can really see how the focus shifts dramatically, doesn't it? From drama and dependence to personal growth, shared responsibility, and mutual support in this empowerment triangle. That sounds like a much more sustainable and positive dynamic.
It truly is. And the sources provide some specific strategies to cultivate this sense of empowerment. Developing your own self-awareness is absolutely crucial. Actively challenging your assumptions, observing your thoughts and feelings so you can catch yourself slipping back into a drama triangle role.
Right, that awareness piece again.
Learning and consistently practicing those healthy boundary-setting skills we discussed is also key, knowing when and how to say no, limiting engagement in toxic situations, communicating your needs clearly.
What about mindset? Does that play a role?
Absolutely. Cultivating a growth mindset, viewing challenges as opportunities for learning, recognizing your own agency is fundamental for building confidence and independence.
Okay.
Fostering open and honest communication in relationships where people feel safe to express themselves without fear also strongly supports healthier dynamics.
Yeah, creating safety.
And perhaps most importantly, practicing self-compassion and empathy. Being kind to yourself and others when you inevitably fall back into old patterns, and trying to understand different perspectives, that creates a much more supportive environment for change. Some sources even suggest seeking out mentors or coaches for tailored strategies.
It's really helpful to remember that making these kinds of changes takes time and consistent effort. Now, are there any common misunderstandings about the drama triangle that we should maybe clarify?
Yes, there are a few important ones, I think. One common misconception is the idea that these roles are fixed personality traits.
Like, oh, he's just a persecutor.
Exactly. It's really important to remember these are patterns of behavior that we learn and adopt. And because they are learned, they absolutely can be unlearned and changed.
That's hopeful.
It is. Another misunderstanding is the tendency to solely blame the persecutor. While their behavior is often the most overtly damaging, the drama triangle is actually a systemic issue.
Everyone plays a part.
Right. Everyone involved plays a contributing role, and focusing all the blame on one person doesn't address the underlying dynamics that keep the cycle going. And finally, it's crucial to remember that making lasting change is possible with conscious effort, willingness, and self-reflection.
That's a really important point to emphasize. It's not about labeling people as inherently bad, but about understanding the often unconscious patterns we all can fall into, and then learning how to make healthier choices.
Exactly right.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive. It's quite eye-opening to see how this model, developed so long ago, still resonates so strongly today in helping us understand, well, the complexities of our relationships.
What's truly fascinating, I think, is just how universal these dynamics are and how much more fulfilling and healthy our interactions can become when we consciously move away from the drama triangle and towards these more empowered ways of relating.
So to wrap up this deep dive then, it sounds like the drama triangle, with its familiar roles of victim, rescuer, and persecutor, is fundamentally a learned pattern of interaction, often fueled by that underlying feeling of shame we talked about, rather than just being an inherent part of who we are.
That's precisely right. And breaking free from this pattern requires that initial step of self-awareness, a genuine willingness to actively make changes in your behavior and thought patterns, and then consistently taking action to adopt those healthier, more empowered ways of relating.
So for you, our listener, I'd really encourage you to take a thoughtful moment to reflect on your own relationships, both personal and professional. Can you recognize any of these roles playing out, either for yourself or in the behavior of others around you?
Truly understanding these dynamics is the very first and most crucial step towards building healthier, more authentic relationships, relationships based on mutual respect, genuine support, and empowerment, rather than on that draining cycle of blame, guilt, and dependence.
And on that important note, here's a final thought for you to consider. Think about a familiar conflict in your life, one that tends to repeat, or maybe just leaves you feeling drained. How might the entire outcome, and perhaps even more importantly, your own sense of well-being, fundamentally change if you consciously chose to shift your role in that dynamic? And what small, concrete step could you maybe take today to actively move towards a more empowered and fulfilling way of relating? Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.